Welcome to the Daily Plunge. We are in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. So Paul has already begun to take a collection for the churches around Jerusalem that are going through a famine. And this is God's work that's going on through this collection to help a needy church. And Paul says, we want to give you a testimony also about what God was doing in the churches in the Macedonia area, how God's grace was poured out to them, that even in the midst of a severe trial of their faith, and even though not a wealthy church, he describes them as having deep poverty, they still had abundant joy, and they gave themselves first to the Lord, which challenges us to think, who do you give yourself to? Are you giving yourself to the Lord or yourself or to something else? And he says they begged for the favor to give to support the churches down in Jerusalem. And here's a really important idea. Never deny somebody the privilege of giving, because never deny somebody the opportunity to give, no matter what you think their circumstances are, because they're making a gift not to a budget, they're making a sacrifice to God. Now he goes on to say that that I know that you, the Corinthians, excel at generous giving. And when you love, you think about this, when you love somebody, you give yourself and you're giving empathy. And so this gift towards the churches that are struggling down around Jerusalem is about showing that love and giving of themselves to another church, right? And so Paul then goes on in verse 9 to say, our own Lord, he was rich and became poor for your sake. And he took on the poverty of our sin. First, he took on the poverty of our humanness, but then he took on the poverty of our sin. And in exchange, he made us rich with his righteousness. And so Paul is setting out a biblical model, precedent, that we're supposed to imitate Jesus in a way with this. And he talks about how you have an abundance. You have the blessing of abundance. All of us, each and every day, we have an abundance of God's riches. But do we have that mindset, or do we think that we're always needy and that we're always living with scarcity? And rather than being satisfied with what God does in our lives, we are discontent. And so Paul says, you're giving out of your abundance because you have a need that comes from the Jerusalem church, which is the need to be empathetic. And he says, and you're satisfying their needs so they can give out of the abundance of what they have, which is perseverance in the faith. And so he goes on in verse 15 that, God provides for all. And this is a reference to when God gave manna to the Israelites in the wilderness. And he said, those who gathered much had enough for what they needed, and those who gathered little had enough for what they needed. And the basic idea here simply is that God provides, whether you need a lot or you need a little. God is always providing. And so the bigger question for you is, has the Lord made you content? Because that's a gift. Contentment is a gift from God, that you look around and at what you have and you're content. And has the Lord made you generous? Because generosity is a gift of the Spirit. If we have Christ, we should have a generous spirit. Well, hey, thanks a lot, friends. Have a blessed day.